Okay, today's date is 22 May 2024. My name is Dennis Gill with the Americans in Wartime Experience, and I've got the pleasure of speaking with John Luckadoo virtually. Thank you, John, for sitting down and sharing your story with us.
It's John Luckadoo.
Luckadoo, I'm sorry, Luckadoo. Yeah. Luckadoo. Make sure I get that right.
I'm in Dallas, Dennis.
You're in Dallas. Okay. Well, I am in Virginia, and through the power of the internet, we can get together and we can talk a little bit.
Wonderful.
So if you could just give me a little bit of background on who you are. Where were you born? Where did you grow up, go to high school, that kind of thing?
Well, I was born in 1922, 102 years ago, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and grew up there and went through public schools and until Pearl Harbor occurred, and I joined the aviation cadets or joined the Army Air Corps as an aviation cadet right after Pearl Harbor.
Okay. Can you tell us about that day? What do you remember about hearing about Pearl Harbor?
Well, the day that Pearl Harbor occurred was a Sunday afternoon in Chattanooga. I was engaged at the time in driving a bunch of my neighbors' kids around the neighborhood, which we often did, joyriding on a Sunday afternoon. They were very generous in making their cars available to me, considered I was responsible enough to take their children around. And we were listening to the radio, the car radio, when it was interrupted to announce that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Well, of course, we didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was. However, I was all of 18 years old at the time, and I realized full well the implications of it because prior to Pearl Harbor, upon graduation from high school, my best friend and I had determined that since we wanted to fly, the best thing we could do would be to go to Canada and join the Royal Canadian Air Force and get our flight training, get our commissions, and then once America, which we were sure eventually would be involved, was that we could transfer in grade and we'd be a step or two ahead of our buddies. And we thought that was a pretty cool idea, but unfortunately it required 2 years of college to join the Air Corps. And we had just graduated from high school, so we didn't qualify. But when we got the applications from the RCAF, it required parental consent. And my best friend was an only child. He was all his mother had because his father had been a World War I veteran and mustard gassed in the process and died a very horrible death, and he never knew his dad. But she agreed to allow him to go, but my parents would not allow me to go. So he went and I went to college, and that's where I was when Pearl Harbor occurred, and I got into the Army Air Corps as a cadet.
Okay. What was it about flying that attracted you?
Well, I guess it was sort of glamorous to us. We thought that it was a far superior way to serve than in the ground troops or the Navy or Marine Corps or some of the other branches. And that I guess the goggles and silk scarf and of flying appealed to us. So that's what we aspired to.
Right, right. Did you have any other family members that served in the military?
I did. I had 3 siblings. I had an older brother, an older sister, and a younger brother. And both my brothers served. My older brother was directly commissioned as a lieutenant commander because of his chemical engineering qualifications as a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and spent the entire war in Washington. We never knew exactly what he was doing, but discovered finally that he had been engaged in developing biological warfare in case it was needed. My younger brother, 2 years younger than I, joined the Merchant Marines as a cadet when he was eligible by age, and spent World War II flying the North Atlantic on Liberty ships in convoys, taking war materials back and forth to Europe.
So when you, well, let me start with this. What year did you earn your commission?
I was commissioned in 1943.
Okay.
Early 1943, February 13th.
Okay.
And that was one of the strange things that happened to the group that I was assigned to directly upon graduation. They took 40 of my classmates and me and sent us directly to a B-17 group that was then about to ship out overseas, that was stationed in Kearney, Nebraska, called the 100th Bomb Group.
Okay.
That later known as the Bloody Hundredth. And that was the group that is the focus and subject of the recently released documentary series by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg entitled Masters of the Air.
Okay. Now, when you had dreams of flying aircraft, did you have any particular type of aircraft that you were interested in? Did you want to be a fighter pilot, a bomber pilot, or did you just want to fly?
Dennis, I think everybody that goes into the Air Force as a pilot wants to fly, wants to be a fighter pilot. They have the fun. The bomber pilots, of course, are saddled with the responsibility for not only their own hides, but the crew that they're assigned to. And in my case, it was a 10-man crew.
Right.
And when we were substituted for all of the original co-pilots, we'd never been in a B-17. And it was really a very strange occurrence that they would do this to this one group, because they did not do it to any other group in the 8th Air Force. But it severely hobbled that organization, because we were totally unfamiliar with the equipment. We hadn't had any training, and we were shipped out shortly thereafter and had to learn on the job. And we were second in command of the crew.
Right.
So if anything happened to incapacitate the pilot, we took over. So we had to mature pretty rapidly, and we had to learn very quickly.
Right.
And that was the way we went to war.
Right. And do you have any training at all, any flight training at all prior to that point?
None.
None. Okay. So you learned on the job pretty much.
We didn't have any choice.
Yeah.
We suddenly found ourselves as citizen soldiers in the right-hand seat of a huge 4-engine bomber, and second in command, as I mentioned, of the crew. So we had to learn and learn fast.
Right.
And we were going against we were sent to England, of course, to go against a very formidable enemy, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, who was battle tested, having been fighting for 4 years when we got there. And they were, of course, were defending their homeland, and we were 6,000 miles away.
Right. So what goes through your mind? You're going over there, to do all the things you just mentioned. You have pretty much no flight training whatsoever. What's going on? What's going through a young person's mind when you find yourself in that situation?
You're really scared to death, to be truthful. You don't know what you're going to be confronted with, but you know that it's pretty ominous, it's pretty formidable, and it's deadly, if you'll forgive the pun, because your life is on the line every time you go out, and you're confronted by someone that or a force that is far better equipped to fight in the air war than you are. Consequently, I had to look to my pilot to train me or to give me what training and instruction that I could glean to fulfill my responsibilities. And as you might imagine, some of the crews greatly resented the fact that their co-pilots were suddenly jerked out. They had been all the way through training, pre-combat training, together as a team. And in a particular case of my crew, the navigator and the bombardier were extremely fond of their previous co-pilot. They buddied with him and drank with him and partied with him, and they were just highly resentful that somebody that was completely unfamiliar with the crew and unfamiliar with the equipment and hadn't had any training was suddenly thrust in the position that we were. And as a consequence, they made my life hell. They did everything in their power to try and dissuade me from continuing and throwing in the towel. And Lord knows what they would have gotten in my place if I had. But I was determined to make the best of the cards that were dealt to me. And so I just sucked it up and went on about my duties. And despite their efforts to get me to quit.
Right. So what is the training? What you eventually get trained, obviously, learn how to fly the aircraft. How does that come about? Tell us about the training.
Well, the normal way for them to prepare a crew to go overseas was to go through about 4 months of navigation, formation, gunnery, and familiarize themselves thoroughly with the equipment that they were issued, as well as working as a team. And to suddenly have one link of that team completely removed and replaced by someone who was obviously the weakest link because they were untrained and unfamiliar, was a pretty bitter pill to swallow.
Right.
But that's what they did to the 100th Bomb Group.
And it was out of necessity, I'm assuming. I mean, because the Army's got to know that it's not the best way to do business, but Well,
nobody knows why this was done because it was never done in any other group. It may have been an experiment. It may have been something that some armchair general thought up that would be a smart thing to do. but it was really idiotic, and it greatly hobbled and weakened the ability of the group to function as an organization. Mm-hmm. So we got to war and got involved with two strikes against us to begin with. And that was one of the reasons why our losses, I'm sure, were as severe as they were to begin with. Another reason was that theoretically, we were supposed to have fighter escort to help us protect ourselves against the incoming fighters, as well as the anti-aircraft defenses that they could throw up. But that was a myth, and that did not work out as it was supposed to. So all in all, we went to war with one hand tied behind our backs, I guess you'd call it. And as I mentioned, we certainly were scared to death of what we were going to be confronted with. We had nobody to tell us, nobody to warn us what the Germans had developed for us, their techniques, their battle-tested way of conducting an air war. They had fought against the Russians on the Eastern Front and the British on the Western, and they knew what they were doing. And as I mentioned, their backs were to the wall. They were defending their homeland.
Right.
So their incentive was far different than ours.
Right, right. So where were you stationed in England?
At a place called Thorpe Abbots. This was a small village outside the town of Diss, D-I-S-S, located about 80 miles northeast of London in what was known as East Anglia. Mm-hmm. And that was the part of England that jutted out into the North Sea toward the European continent.
Okay. How long after you get there are you on your first mission?
Almost immediately. We had been delayed in going over. We were issued new aircraft with additional fuel tanks to make the long trip from Newfoundland to Scotland. And in order to successfully do that, we had to wait in Newfoundland until the winds were favorable to help us, or we wouldn't make it. And so while we were waiting, this pilot that I was assigned to, or in my crew, chose to go across the base one night and romance with a British WAF, and ended up with a raging case of VD in the hospital. So while the rest of the group went ahead and took off and successfully went to Scotland, this crew that I was on had to sit there for 2 weeks waiting for him to recover, being treated with sulfa, which was the only thing they had in those days.
Right.
And he was bedridden, and when he was finally released, he was so weak that he couldn't stand up, so we had to load him into the airplane. And he said, "Well, Lucky, I guess you're going to have to fly because I can't." And I said, "Well, that's pretty darned obvious, isn't it?" And so I called this navigator and bombardier over, and I said, "Now, look, you guys have never accepted me, and you've made my life miserable, but now you're going to have to depend on me to get us to combat." So I told the navigator that if he didn't make landfall on the nose, that I was personally going to throw his ass out of the plane without a parachute. So it tended to lower or to level the playing field somewhat. And that's how we went to war.
Right. Now, how much stick time did you have by this point?
Well, I had a total of about 250 hours, including my flight training.
Okay.
But in the B-17, I had only about 30 hours.
Okay.
And most of those, of course, was just following the pilot through on his landings and takeoffs and learning about the fuel transfers and all of the mechanical responsibilities that a co-pilot is supposed to fulfill.
Right.
So it was really a big handful, but that's what I was confronted with. And as far as stick time was concerned, I had very, very little.
Right.
Because he was pretty selfish in wanting to make the landings and takeoffs himself. And it proved to be almost disastrous because when he became incapacitated, why I had to take over, and he hadn't prepared me very well for taking over.
Right.
It was his own fault.
So what do you remember, other than that part of the mission, what do you remember most about your first mission? What kind of, if you can relate a little bit, what it's like to finally get in the air and now you're being shot at by the enemy? What goes through somebody's mind when that starts to happen?
Well, our first mission was an extremely long one. It was to bomb the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, which was way down in southern France along the coast. And we had to fly for about 11 hours over the ocean out at sea. We didn't go over land in order to get there. So we didn't encounter really much opposition from fighter forces or anti-aircraft as a consequence of that until we got near the target. And then they let everything go at us. And of course, we got our baptism of fire and lost 3 ships on that mission, but we managed to make it back. And this pilot that I was assigned to was sort of humiliated with his behavior, so he volunteered us for every mission. And his thought was that he would finish his missions before anybody else and be rotated back to the States to his family. He was married, had a son. That's what we named the plane Sonny. And so he was anxious to fulfill his obligation in combat. And of course, the crew had to go along with him. We didn't have any choice.
Right. Because correct me if I'm wrong. If the mission that you're on is not successful, you would generally repeat that mission, correct? So if the target wasn't destroyed or sufficiently damaged, you would have to go back and hit it again. Is that true? Exactly.
Our rules of engagement when we started out were, and we had no fighter escorts that could accompany us, so we were out by ourselves, flying these unpressurized airplanes at high altitude, 25 to 29,000 feet. And when we got to the target, if it was closed by cloud cover and we couldn't visually identify it, we were not allowed to bomb. So we had to go to a secondary target. If that too was closed, then we would bring our bombs back and drop them in the channel rather than land with them because they were dangerous and the extra weight and of course the possibility of their detonating was pretty great. So that was those were the conditions that we had, and if the target was closed and we were unable to attack it. Then we had to go back maybe the next day or soon thereafter to attack it again.
Okay. Now you were the co-pilot most of the time, but not every time, correct? Was there a mission or two where you were a gunner?
Well, they developed a procedure whereby if the crew was designated to lead the formation, it was a lead crew. The co-pilot then was replaced by a command pilot who was then in command of the entire formation. And the co-pilot was designated to go back to fly the tail gun position.
Okay.
Well, good night. I'd never fired a 50 caliber in my life. And they put me in the tail on our first lead mission. I had no idea of what I was supposed to do or how they loaded the guns for me, and they were my responsibility. And unbeknownst to me, if you bore down on the triggers for more than 3 seconds, the heat from the shells going through the barrels would burn the barrels out. And that's precisely what I did immediately when we came under attack. So when I got back, I said, this is foolish. I was trained to fly the airplane, not to be a gunner. So I'm not going to get in the tail again. And they said, well, then you'll have to sit on the ground. So when they led, when the crew led, I had to sit on the ground and missed 4 missions. They did fly almost successively the earlier missions that the group flew, and finished up a tour in 89 days, which was unheard of. But at least it proved that we could survive a tour of 25 missions, which was what was required before we'd be rotated back to the States.
Right. What would your relationship be with the crew after the first mission and then the subsequent missions? I mean, you said it was a bad relationship to begin with. Did it ever improve?
Well, it did eventually as our tour progressed. They came to realize that they were going to have to put up with me for one thing. And another thing was that I was learning pretty rapidly and that I was upholding my end of the bargain and performing as well as I could, which was amazingly amazing under the conditions.
Right.
But you do what you have to do. And I was determined that I was going to succeed, so I did. And eventually, the crew accepted me, at least sort of at arm's length, we'll say.
Right. Right.
We never became chummy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what were your impressions of the B-17?
I was very in love with it. I was quite impressed with its ability to withstand battle damage and still fly, still get us home. And that was very impressive to me. So much so that after I was returned to the States, one of the first things I did was go buy some Boeing stock. Because I really believe that they had created a superior piece of equipment, and it was superior to, in my view, to the B-24, which was the other heavy bomber that the Air Force was employing.
Right.
But nevertheless, it was a dream to fly, and I love to fly it. And so I became very attached to it and very appreciative of the fact that that was what I was assigned and not something else.
Yeah. You had another experience, I remember reading in your book, where you had caught some flak through the front window, and it caused, I guess it had caused air to come in, and you suffered frostbite, correct, on your feet?
Yes, on one mission, the plexiglass nose that the bombardier sighted his bomb sight through was penetrated by a piece of shrapnel, and it created an ice-cold jet of air that was directed up into the cockpit, which was slightly above the compartment where the bombardier and the navigator operated. And it was directed right onto my feet. And I couldn't move my feet because I had to use the rudders to fly in the fly formation. And that was a very precision and precise occupation for us, because if we got forced out of the formation and had to go separately, then we were pretty sitting ducks for the Germans to pick off at will. So we avoided that at all costs if we could. But the temperatures at unpressurized at our altitudes were minus 50 to 60 degrees below zero. This is one of the things that we contended with that had such a profound effect on our ability to perform. Mm-hmm. And we had to endure that for hours on end. And that's not something you can convey either in narrative form in books or certainly in film or any other way. It's just something you have to withstand, and it seriously impaired our ability to function very efficiently at high altitude.
Yeah. How do you cope with the stress?
Well, it's an individual thing, of course. We all had our demons. We all had our suspicions, our superstitions that we believed would help us survive, and exercise those to the fullest. In my case, I found that I had to just focus on flying and on keeping the airplane functioning and performing my duties and not worrying about my chances. Mm-hmm. If you really wallowed in self-pity about the odds against you, you were not going to make it. And so that was something that I didn't allow myself to succumb to. Some people did. They couldn't avoid it, or they didn't have any choice. But nevertheless, I found that just by staying as focused as I could and staying as busy as I could, then my chances were that much better, and it worked.
Yeah. What were the people like, the English people that you had interaction with?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your question.
Yeah. What the English people, the people that were there, the English, what were they like? Were they appreciative of you being there, supportive, that kind of thing?
Well, the British really were very hospitable, particularly the younger ones, the kids. Mm-hmm. They used to line the airfield and we'd bring them in and give them Christmas parties or birthdays or try to make friends with them. We did not have an opportunity because we were so concentrated on flying if we could possibly do so, regardless of the weather. The weather in Europe was lousy. We had fog and rain and clouds and bitter cold. So the conditions were very demanding, and as a consequence, we had to watch our P's and Q's in order to live up to it or withstand it. And the British were appreciative of the fact that we were there. However, we were not aware as airmen that the Royal Air Force, the Bomber Force, commanded by Sir Arthur Harris, bitterly opposed our going out and flying in daytime. Mm-hmm. And they begged us to abandon daylight bombing and join them in nighttime bombing, because they considered that could be done at lower altitude where the weather was not quite so bad, and you didn't have to fly formation, and that if we could double their impact on the German industrial setup, that we could defeat them far quicker that way than utilizing the bomber force and bombing by day and having them bomb at night. But our commanders refused, and we had to continue to try and prove their strategy. But this wasn't known to us. This raging debate was going on behind the scenes and
right.
Higher echelon, and we were just guinea pigs. We were just trying to prove the theory that daylight mass formation bombing was with the Norden bomb site, which was supposedly our secret weapon, which it was anything but nevertheless, that was their strategy, their theory, and they stuck with it throughout the war.
Yeah. What did you do for downtime? Did you have any R&R? Did you get to go anywhere, maybe to London or anything like that?
Personally, I didn't. While I was with the original crew for the first 21 missions, we were flying all the time. We never went to a rest home. We were never withdrawn from flying. We were ready to go or pressed into service almost consistently. And so I didn't have any leave time or downtime. If there were weather conditions or if an aircraft was so badly damaged that it wasn't flyable, then we might have an extra day that we could read or maybe get a little extra sack time. But by and large, we just flew our butts off. And that was what we were there to do. That was the job that we were assigned. And we were determined that we were going to do it as quickly as we could and get it over with if we survived.
Yeah. You know, the odds were pretty much against you guys. And I know that the combat was very, very intense. How do you prepare for that each day before you take off on a mission? This could be your last mission. And how do you prepare mentally to address that?
Well, I think it's a personal thing, and the only way that I found that I could was by, as I say, staying focused and concentrating on what I was doing and enhancing my chances by becoming more familiar with the equipment and with the airplane and the job that we were assigned. it was just a matter of luck if you did survive. And I'm convinced that you have to have a guardian angel on both shoulders or you wouldn't. Initially, when we got there and began combat flying, our chances were 1 in 4, less than 25%. Out of the 40 of my classmates that went to this one bomb group, only 4 completed a tour. The rest were either shot down, killed, or came home.
Yeah. And you completed how many missions?
25.
25. What were your thoughts and feelings after you completed that last mission?
Well, the last mission was really, I was at that time serving not only as a pilot or a command pilot, but also as an operations officer for the squadron. And in that position, you get to, or required to designate who flies out of your organization and where and what makes up their crew, because sometimes you have to substitute people on certain crews. You have to make sure that the aircrafts are properly maintained and equipped. You have to, and of course, the bomb load is determined depending upon what your targets were. And you're busy as a one-armed paper hanger. And that was the situation I found myself in when I flew my last mission as a command pilot in charge of the formation against a guided missile base on the shores of France. And all of a sudden, having completed my tour, I was out of a job. I had nothing to do. I was so focused and so intent upon doing what I had been doing for almost a year that suddenly not having any responsibility was rattling. And I discovered, I didn't realize it at the time, and neither did the authorities, that really it produced post-traumatic distress for me.
Right.
And I said, for God's sake, give me something to do. I've got this experience, and let me pass it on to these replacements that are coming in. The war's still going on. And certainly what I've learned and how I've learned it can be of use and value to those who are following me. But they didn't see it that way. They kept sending me on leave and shipped me back home, which took 12 days by sea on a slow boat. And then I spent 30 days at home, which nearly wrecked me. And then they sent me down to Miami Beach for what was called a redistribution center. And we were rationed to a quart of whiskey a day. We had coupons, but you could walk into any bar on any corner and order all you could hold. But so that became a pretty easy way to cope, and that was not good because you could waste yourself very quickly over imbibing. But anyway, they finally determined that I was suffering from combat fatigue, and they sent me to a hospital over in St. Petersburg, Florida. And anybody that was sent over there had to stay 6 weeks. But we didn't have anything to do. We just lay on the beach or sunned ourselves or went down to the corner bar. Had to answer roll call at 8 o'clock every morning, but other than that, we had no duties whatsoever. So that was tough to shoulder. And then when I finally got an assignment, it was to Bryan, Texas, to the only instrument pilot school that they had in America, run by a former airlines pilot. And I thought, my goodness, I needed that before I went to combat, not after. So I was very piqued that they would do that to me. And fortunately, however, it worked out to be a very lucky thing from my standpoint, because I found there was a fraternity brother who was an instructor there, and he was madly in love with one of the local gals who had an older sister. And his fiancée had a house guest one weekend, the first weekend I was there. And he said, I'll get you a blind date with the house guest, and we'll triple date with her sister and with my fiance's sister and her date. And we'll take the girls out to the officers' club on Saturday night and for dinner and dancing. And so I said, okay, that sounds pretty good. So we get out to the officers' club, and I take one look at the older sister. And I said, oh my, I got the wrong date. So we danced and got acquainted, and I asked her for her phone number so I could give her a call and maybe take her to dinner and a movie. And she said, well, I'm sorry, but I'm booked up for 2 weeks. And I said, really? And she said, yeah. So I said, well, put me down for 2 weeks from now. So I was there for 6 weeks and finally did get to take her out, and history was recorded from then on.
Right.
We eventually fell madly in love and were married for 71 years.
Wow. Wow. That's pretty cool. You would eventually write a book, correct?
Well, I didn't write it. I got a writer to collaborate with me.
Right.
He had heard my stories or saw them on the internet, and he said he wanted to read my book. And I said, I don't have a book. And he said, well, you should. And I've written 10. And I'd like to write your story. Would you collaborate with me? And so we decided to join forces, and he would come to Dallas. He lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and interview me, and then go back and write a couple of chapters and send them to me, and then we would produce the book in that fashion. And then that's when COVID hit. And he said, well, I don't dare come to Dallas. And we'd never met. He had just called me out of the blue, and we met over the phone.
Okay.
But we agreed to collaborate. And so he started interviewing me almost daily for an hour, 2 hours. And we carried that out for 18 months, and still never meeting face to face until the book was published. But he did a marvelous job. He turned out to be an excellent writer. I told him I was sorry, but I wasn't familiar with his writing, and I wasn't sure that it would his writing style would suit my purposes. And he said, well, he would send me some copies of what he had written, and all of his previous writing had been about ground troops. He'd never written anything about the air, so he wasn't familiar with Air Force terminology and equipment and that sort of thing. But
right.
He was a very quick learner, and he did extensive research and acquainted himself with it. And of course, I educated him as best I could. And it worked out because I think his ability to narrate what I told him and how I told it to him was exemplary. I was very fortunate to have crossed paths with him.
Yeah, I have read the book, and it is an excellent book, I will say. You have an amazing story, which transcends, and the writing is good, obviously, but the story is what really stands out, I think. So as we sit here in May of 2024, the series that you referred to earlier, Masters of the Air, it came out earlier this year, is wrapped up a few months ago. Did you have a chance to watch it?
Oh, yes.
What were your impressions on it? What did you think they got right? What could they have done better on?
Well, that's exactly what Tom Hanks asked me when they flew me out to California for the premiere. And I said, well, Tom, I'm sorry, but I'm going to reserve my opinion until I've seen all 9 episodes because I've only seen 1.
Right.
And he said, okay, we'll talk afterwards. So we've yet to do that. But as far as the series is concerned, I don't know whether you're aware or not, but it was over 10 years in production.
Yes, I am. Yep.
And during that time, they interviewed me on several occasions, about 5, I think, along with others who were still living and were actually there. And the series, I was very interested to see how they, and if they did, treat some of the things that happened to the 100th that didn't happen to any other group. But the one thing that I was most interested in was the fact that the series is really about personalities of individuals who were in the group that I flew with. I didn't fly in the same airplanes with them necessarily, but I did fly with them in the same formations. I knew them, they knew me, and I was, of course, acquainted with their personalities. They said, well, Lucky, you're not going to be in the movie. And I said, well, I didn't expect to be. They said, no, we're going to have a 21-year-old British actor impersonate you. And I said, well, that's the age we were when we were there. But I soon learned as the episodes unfolded that they didn't look like that. They tried to impersonate the personalities of these rather flamboyant characters that were members of our organization, and they left their imprint on the group, and we all knew them, and it was part and parcel of our experience. But after the 9th episode, Tom Hanks narrated another hour of a documentary that he called The Bloody Hundredth. And in that, he drew from excerpts of the interviews that he made with those of us who were there. And that really portrayed more of what the group accomplished as an organization during the 2 years that they were in combat than the docuseries did. But they did a very fine job. It's an epic. A good deal of it is dedicated to experiences that were had in prisoner of war camp, which I didn't have, so I was unfamiliar with, fortunately. But that's how they introduced some of the things that were not part and parcel of our experience. For example, they brought in the Tuskegee Airmen, who were the P-51 Red Tail fighter escorts. We never saw them. They were not part and parcel of the 8th Air Force. They were operating out of North Africa and Italy.
Right.
And but they introduced them into the series through the POW camps. From some of those that were shot down and how they mixed with the members of the 100th. So I certainly take my hat off to them. I think they did a marvelous job of portraying something of what we did and how we did it and what impact it had on us.
Right.
However, sadly, they omitted mentioning a number of things that happened to the 100th that I think should be documented, that have never been explained, have never been historically recognized, and they did not see fit to do so in the series.
Yeah. What are some of those things that you're talking about?
Well, the first one was introducing 40 of my classmates as co-pilots to the group.
Yeah.
That's never been documented or picked up by anybody, and it didn't happen to any other group. Another was how the 100th got its name or tag, the Bloody Hundredth. And that was recording the losses, the heavy losses that we sustained, not only initially, but when we lost big. We didn't lose the most of any group that served over there, but we were second or third. But when we, in fact, on one mission on October the 10th of 1943 to Munster, we could only put up 13 airplanes in our formation, and only one came home. And that was Rosie Rosenthal on his third mission. So those things were not highlighted. They were not really documented as they could have been, in my view.
Right.
But there was also a myth about on the Regensburg mission in August of 43. The rumor got started that although there was a code of the air with the Germans that if a bomber was so badly damaged that it couldn't make it back to England and you wanted to surrender, you could lower your wheels and signify that you were giving up. And then the fighters would come alongside you and escort you to the nearest airdrome, and you'd land and be taken prisoner. Well, some wag, I think, in a bar one night said, well, what do you think if the gunners shot those escorts down? And then the group would be marked from then on as not living up to the code. And I think as the story became embellished and retold, told and retold. It was expanded, and somebody said, well, if that happened, it all have to happen in the 100th. And so we got tagged with that, although it did not happen. And that's been proven and documented that by both the British and the Germans, as well as the Americans, that the crew that was attributed to was not even in that vicinity when they were knocked down. And the Germans have admitted that they couldn't tell one group from the other when they were in the air. And they didn't care because they got double credit every time they knocked a bomber down. So they weren't interested in whether it had a square D on the tail or whether it had a triangle A or whatnot. They were just interested in attacking the bombers.
Right.
So those things were not clarified or were not brought out. And there were some of the things that I felt personally they missed the golden opportunity to set the record straight and record what actually did happen and has now been proven.
Right, right. How do you think your experiences during World War II influenced your life after the war?
Profoundly, without any question. It certainly made me grow up in a hell of a hurry overnight. I didn't have any choice. I was just a hairy-headed college kid like all of my comrades when I went to war, and suddenly to be confronted with death on a daily basis, you have no choice but to mature and become very serious about what you're doing, the job that you were sent there to do, and do it the best that you know how, and devoting yourself to making sure that our freedom and our values were going to be respected by defeating a very formidable enemy.
Right.
So it had a very serious effect. Certainly, I think my wife had a more serious effect on me because she realized that I was suffering from combat fatigue and saw things in me that I didn't know I had, and encouraged me in ways I would never have otherwise, I'm sure, experienced. And I'm just extremely grateful and thankful that our paths crossed.
Right. You mentioned earlier, you're 102 years old?
102.
102. And you were the last surviving member, correct, of the 100th?
No, I'm the last surviving pilot of the original group.
Okay.
I'm not the last of the bomb group at all, but I am the last original pilot of the bomb group that went overseas, and that's a fact.
Yeah, yeah. How does that? How do you handle that? Because you're the guy that they go to when they have questions and when they want to get an interview, kind of like what we're doing today. Is that something you embrace, telling your story, or can it be kind of burdensome after a while?
Well, Dennis, I didn't care to talk about it for 50 years. After I got back and got married, I did not burden my family with it. It was a closed chapter in my life. Mm-hmm. It was not a pleasant memory to recall. And as a result, I wanted to forget it. I didn't want to remember it.
Yeah.
And then in 1999, I was invited by the chancellor of the University of North Texas to be the keynote speaker at a luncheon in his symposium that he had annually, where he would have an academic make a lecture, a morning lecture and question and answer period about war. And then he would actually have a veteran speak to the luncheon group when they retired to the luncheon, to the cafeteria or the restaurant for lunch. And he asked me if I would relate my wartime experiences. And I said, well, I haven't done that. And he said, well, I think that you would be a very interesting speaker. So I did speak, and at the end of it, he said, Lucky, did you write that speech? And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I did, because I didn't know what I wanted to say or how I wanted to say it. And he said, well, I'm writing a book about some of the speeches that have been made at my symposium called Warriors and Scholars. And I would love, with your permission, to include yours in that book. And I said, well, okay, here's a copy of my speech. So he did include it. And as a result of the book and the lecture, I was invited by a number of people that were in attendance who were Rotarians or Kiwanians or lived in retirement facilities or professors, particularly to speak to students and tell them about my experience. And I found myself suddenly on the lecture circuit, being asked repeatedly to speak about my experiences and how they affected me. And as a result, I developed a PowerPoint presentation. And so I've been speaking for 25 years now, and they can't shut me up.
As we wrap up this interview, I wonder if you could just tell us what you think that future generations should know about your service and the men that you served with. What would you like them to know?
Well, I would certainly like to say that the younger generations, successive generations, should know from those of us who were there and experienced it what sacrifices were made up to and including the ultimate sacrifice, or they wouldn't be here. And hearing it from someone who actually experienced it is far different, of course, than reading about it or being told by an historian or somebody who has researched the history of World War II. I am convinced, in speaking to school children, which I do quite frequently, from all the way from elementary school up through Air Force Academy cadets and college, that they're more appreciative of hearing it from someone like me who actually has experienced it, and it's more meaningful to them. I got to a point at one stage while my wife was still with me to say that I was sick to death of my story. I'd heard it so many darn times, and I'd been there and done that, and I was going to hang it up. I was going to retire. And she said, no, you can't. You really have a duty and an obligation to successive generations to make them aware as well as you can and as long as you can of what sacrifices were made on their account to protect these precious freedoms that we enjoy. And so, of course, that's what I spend my time doing.
Right.
I'm frequently asked if current generations would, in my view, measure up as well as we did. And we don't know. We didn't know ourselves how we would measure up until we were forced to, until we were put in that position. And no one really knows what they're capable of doing until they have to do it, or they're put in a position of doing it or else. So I don't discount the fact that they've got as much guts as we had. They're as patriotic as we are. Unfortunately, our country is sadly divided. Mm-hmm. When we took an oath in going into the service that we would defend our Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, we didn't realize that we could be betrayed from within. And that's what we're experiencing today. And our country is sadly divided. And it wasn't, you cannot believe, and I spend a lot of time trying to convince people that America came together like no other country has ever done when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. And we outproduced the world. And without those people who weren't in uniform, but who so strongly and effectively supported us, we've never thanked them. We ought to have a day dedicated by Congress, set aside for the home front heroes. And that's one of my missions remaining in the time I have left. So see that that's done.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, Lucky, I really appreciate you you taking some time out of your day to talk to us. You know, we met in November, I think it was, of 2023. So 6-7 months ago in D.C. And yes. Ever since then, I've really been looking forward to speaking with you. I know you're a very busy man.
Well, thank you, Dennis. And I know you are too. And I hope I didn't disappoint you.
Nope, you did not. So I just want to say one last thing. On behalf of the Americans in Wartime Experience, I thank you, sir, again, for sitting down and talking to us. But more importantly, I thank you for the service to your country, both during World War II and since. You've continued to serve, telling your story and getting that message out to this generation and future generations is certainly very important, and you continue to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, and God bless America.
Well, thank you. Amen.